Hello, everybody. I'm Rory Marshall. I'm moderating this next session on the Trainee Data Blitz. Should be fantastic. We've got some great speakers up in this one. The title of the session is Translational Approaches to Understanding the Impacts of Intimate Partner Violence on the Brain. Insights from Australia and Canada. I believe the direction I've got is to read all the bios so we don't have to take breaks in between. And the presenters today have coordinated their efforts, so they should flow seamlessly and nicely orchestrated. So the first bio is for Dr. Georgia Symons. She is an early career researcher in the Monash Trauma Group at Monash University. She co-leads Australia's first research studies of intimate partner violence. She is identifying short and long-term effects of intimate partner violence caused brain injury, integrating clinical data, blood-based biomarkers, neuroimaging, and cognitive assessments to improve diagnoses, health outcomes, and therapeutic options. Following George's presentation will be Charlotte Copas. She's a PhD student at Monash University. Her research investigates the impact of intimate partner violence-caused brain injury on women's physical and mental health. She is identifying biomarkers linked to PTSD and persistent post-concussion symptoms, as well as determining whether aerobic exercise interventions can help reduce symptom burden. Following Charlotte is Olivia Hannon. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Tasmania. Her work explores the intersection of intimate partner violence and complex trauma and cognitive functioning to improve clinical practices and policy responses. Next will be Abigail Astridge. She's a PhD student at Monash University in Australia. She focuses on intimate partner violence-caused brain injury, adverse childhood experiences, resilience, and mental health outcomes. And concluding the Trainee Data Blitz session will be Justin Brand. He is a PhD student at the University of Victoria and Vancouver Island University. He focuses on the pathophysiology of intimate partner violence-caused brain injury and how stress may alter outcomes. He integrates animal and human studies to examine blood biomarkers, learning and memory, behavior, and brain structure. So that's all our amazing trainees. And now let's jump right to the presentation. So first up is Dr. Georgia Symons. After you.
Thank you, Rory. Let's see if this works. Okay, can everyone see that? Cool. Okay, so before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Burrarung and Wurundjeri clans of the Kulin Nations, as well as the Palawa and Pakana clans from Melbourne and Hobart, where we live and reside here in Melbourne and Hobart, and pay our respects to the elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Lekwungen and speaking people whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and the Wasanish peoples. Just, of course, a brief content warning. Please step out if you feel uncomfortable. Take care of yourself. I'd also like to thank all our participants who shared their stories for this research to be possible, and also acknowledge any lived experience within the audience. So I'll start by giving sort of an overview of our research program across Australia and Canada. Wait, sorry. Let me just... Hopefully this is better. Wait. Sorry. And then after that, we'll have our fabulous PhD students give an overview of their PhD research projects. So the initiation of our work within this space came about through many collaborations and connections of many people sort of involved in this conference, and those identifying key research gaps related to this underserved population of intimate partner violence victim survivors. And so at the time of our research program initiation, my supervisor, Professor Sandy Schultz, and we'd been working a lot in sports concussion. And so we were able to sort of shift our expertise and our research methods from sports concussion into this population. And so our research sort of aims to investigate some of these key priorities that have been identified by the field. So, for example, what are the unique long-term implications of IPV-BI? How does non-fatal strangulation contribute, and can we develop more objective tools from this? And sort of these themes will be woven into the talks that you'll hear within our session. So the initiation of this work came about from a research grant awarded in Australia to Professor Sandy Schultz. And so we gathered together IPV-TBI experts, researchers and clinicians to sort of develop this Australian first research program. And since then, it has now expanded to also include a number of Canadian sites and a number of additional collaborators to sort of grow this work and continue it. This initial grant that was received focused around 3 key aims. So the acute implications of IPV-BI, the chronic or long-term implications, and also developing a rodent model. And specifically, the talks that you'll hear in this session will focus mainly around aim 2 and 3, so the chronic implications and then this rodent model. So I wanted to give a little bit of a background to our studies in particular. So just so the other students wouldn't have to give the full background. Essentially, for our chronic clinical work, we recruited community-dwelling women who were greater than 6 months from their last IPV or last MTBI. And since beginning in August 2023, we've recruited 171 participants in Australia, so Monash University in Melbourne and the University of Tasmania in Hobart. And then this work is now continuing within Canada. So this recruitment process involved disposing advertisement flyers and also posting on social media. And participants that consented to be contacted had a phone interview, and then if they were eligible, came in for 1 or 2 sessions. So session 1 involved demographic information, biopsychosocial questionnaires, blood and saliva biomarkers, and neuropsychological or cognitive assessment. And then a subset also had neuroimaging, MRI and PET. And all the clinical talks that will be within this session are around the data from session 1. And also, I'll note that some of the talks will have slightly different sample sizes, and this is mainly due to the timing of when the analysis occurred, potentially missing data for various methodologies or statistical reasons. And so because brain injury can be quite difficult to define, I wanted to give an overview of how we did it in our research, just so you have a bit of context on that. So to, I guess, gain an insight into brain injury, we used the brain injury screening questionnaire developed at Mount Sinai and this IPV module specifically. So participants indicated how many times they had experienced any of these, I guess, contextual clues, and then how many times did they lose consciousness and how many times were they dazed and confused. And so in an attempt to align this with current diagnostic criteria for mild traumatic brain injury, we took the number of times someone lost consciousness for any of these prompts, and that sort of represents a acute clinical sign of brain injury. And then also, anytime they indicated they were dazed and confused, that is representative of acute symptoms or an alteration of mental status after a brain injury. So those were the two key questions that we used when sort of defining a brain injury within our research. And so I just thought I'd give a little bit of an overview of how we talk about these different terms that you'll hear throughout the session. So head trauma or head impact would be any sort of plausible mechanism of injury to the head or impact to the head. IPV-MTBI would be any mechanism, and if they lost consciousness or were dazed and confused. Non-fatal strangulation would just be that prompt 5, indicating whether they were strangled or suffocated. And then if they were strangled or suffocated and reported a loss of consciousness or dazed and confused, we termed it NFSBI. And then IPV-BI would be IPV-MTBI and NFSBI. And then finally, the little last bit of background, because the clinical context can be quite challenging to, I guess, investigate all the mechanisms of injury that are involved in IPV-BI. We also, within this research program, wanted to develop a novel rodent model to sort of take a translational approach to this research. And this is something that Justin, our final speaker, will touch on. So thank you for that. And then I will let our next speaker, Charlotte, jump right in.
Okay. Cool. So thank you, Georgia, for that very thorough introduction and overview. My name is Charlotte. I don't know if this is working. Okay, yeah. And today I'm going to be walking you through some of the results that we've gotten so far in my PhD work, where we aim to determine predictors of persisting post-concussion symptoms in our study sample that Georgia so nicely went through. So as you've probably all heard throughout this conference, women in physically violent relationships are in a high risk of experience IPV-BI. And one of the long-term outcomes that are just sort of starting to garner clinical and research interest is this phenomenon called persistent post-concussion symptoms, where women who experience IPV-BI may experience or continue to endure TBI symptoms for months or even years after the last or after their injuries, whereas like normally they would sort of resolve on their own within sort of like a 7 to 10 day time frame. And there are a couple of different diagnostic criteria for PPCS, but we chose to align our research with the ICD-10 diagnostic criteria, which they refer to it as post-concussion syndrome, but they define PPCS as a syndrome that occurs following a head trauma sufficiently severe enough to result in a loss of consciousness, and includes 3 out of the 8 sort of constellation of symptoms shown here, persisting for longer than 3 weeks. So because PPCS in IPV-BI context isn't really known, or is only recently starting to garner research interest, we don't really know much about it. However, in military and sports-related concussions and accidental brain injury contexts, it has been sort of researched a little bit, and it's estimated that approximately 15 to 30% of TBI patients will experience PPCS, regardless of how they got their injuries. And furthermore, researchers have determined that female gender, pre and post injury mental health conditions, repetitive head impacts, and delay reporting are all risk factors for PPCS. And unfortunately, a lot of these drivers are extremely common in women who experience intimate partner violence. So on top of this, IPV-BI is routinely overlooked when victim survivors seek medical attention, which is pretty common in and of itself, pretty uncommon. And so subsequently, the long-term effects of unmanaged or untreated IPV-BI are poorly characterized. However, this area is fast growing. So with these last 2 points and the fact that many of the drivers for enduring symptoms are common in IPV survivors, it is likely that PPCS is actually quite common in this population, but again, is overlooked. And sort of as a result, clinicians may not be able to sort of spot a woman who is experiencing PPCS and therefore not able to give adequate treatment for when women are experiencing the long-term effects of their injuries, but are like in a safe environment. So this kind of lays the foundation of my research, and sort of the overarching aim of this project was to investigate the prevalence and risk factors associated with persistent concussion-like symptoms in IPV victim survivors. And to do this, we had two main objectives. So the first is to determine if IPV-BI is associated with increased risk of worse persistent concussion-like symptoms. And second, which is to conduct an exploratory analysis to see if the symptom profiles endorsed by our participants would match the clinical thresholds of the ICD-10 diagnostic PBCS criteria. And sort of as a disclaimer, we use the term concussion-like symptoms to describe the symptoms being presented here. However, we did have participants who did not experience or did not endorse experiencing any sort of probable brain injury. So we're not trying to say that the symptoms that they are like endorsing are because of a brain injury. We're just trying to inform the clinical understanding of PPCS within this IPV context. So Georgia went over a study method, so I won't get too into it. But for my sample specifically, we included 153 women in my analysis. And in the first part, we kept all of the participants together. And then in the second half, we split them up into IPV and MTBI history. So to measure concussion-like symptoms, we use the Rivermead Post-Concussion Symptom Questionnaire, which is the most commonly used questionnaire to measure concussion symptoms. And I've also listed all of the predictors that we looked at in this study that could potentially influence a woman's RPQ score. But for the sake of time today, I'm just going to be talking about the brain injury predictors. So in terms of brain injury variables, all IPV-related brain injuries, so probable MTBIs, head traumas, and non-fatal strangulation events were associated with increased risk of experiencing worse overall symptoms, no matter how many times they occurred. Whereas in contrast with the non-IPV head traumas and probable TBIs, they only were associated with increased risk if a woman had experienced 5 or more probable brain injuries or 10 or more head traumas. And it's also interesting to see here that in the IPV predictors, there are more women reporting higher numbers of the probable brain injuries and within each predictor. But in the non-IPV predictors, more women experience or endorse experiencing fewer, which sort of highlights the repetitive nature of IPV-BI. And then when we broke our participants down into groups, we can see that women who are in the IPV-MTBI group scored significantly higher on the RPQ, so meaning more severe symptoms compared to the healthy controls and MTBI controls. Interestingly, though, the IPV group who with an experience of IPV but endorsed no experience of probable brain injury was not significantly lower than IPV-MTBIs and was significantly higher than healthy controls, which sort of speaks to how nonspecific these concussion-like symptoms are. Which we can further see here when we divided the RPQ into sort of 3 symptom clusters, so somatic symptoms, emotional, and cognitive. And again, we can see this pattern emerging where women in the IPV-MTBI group significantly scored significantly higher across the board than the healthy controls and the TBI controls. And also similarly, the IPV controls have experienced or are significantly higher scores also across the board compared to healthy controls, and higher than the TBI controls in the emotional category. And sort of notably, the one sub-symptom domain that the IPV-TBI group scored higher than the IPV controls was somatic symptoms. So it's like headaches, dizziness, blurred vision, which are commonly associated with brain injury in general. So it's not super surprising. And then sort of lastly, when we look at the number of participants in each group who met ICD-10 diagnostic criteria, women with a history of intimate partner violence brain injury are more likely than anyone in any other group to sort of meet that ICD-10 threshold. And again, we see this pattern where women in the IPV control group still do match diagnostic criteria significantly higher, especially when we look at the symptoms just at like face value. So main takeaways are that IPV brain injury places IPV victim survivors at a higher risk for PPCS and worse persisting symptoms compared to women who have sustained MTBIs in other ways. And interestingly, women in the IPV group also reported worse concussion symptoms compared to healthy and MTBI controls, even though they haven't themselves reported any sort of history of probable traumatic brain injury. And going forward, these findings should suggest that clinicians and support workers should really initiate thorough brain injury and related head trauma, IPV, and mental health histories when assessing patients for brain injury or persistent concussion symptoms, since the results from the PPCS questionnaires and concussion-like symptoms in general can be quite ambiguous without a proper history. As we saw, like the IPV control group did match diagnostic thresholds for PPCS. And yeah, as our knowledge on PPCS expands, and it hopefully gets easier to disentangle PPCS from other neurological or psychological conditions, next steps should really strive to empower collaborations between mental health services and physical rehabilitation services, just in order to offer victim survivors a full sort of breadth of services, no matter what their needs or experiences may be. Thank you.
Awesome. Great talk, Charlotte. Really, really fantastic presentation of data there. Do you want to take a question, or should we move right along?
Oh yeah, I can take a question, sorry.
No, it's all good. So just thinking about your findings and seeing the persistent post-concussion symptoms in both the IPV TBI group and the IPV without TBI group. And you mentioned in your talk there's significant overlap in the post-concussion symptoms in both those groups. What do you think might be some potential reasons that we're seeing that overlap in the findings you presented?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So a lot of the concussion symptoms, when you look at the RPQ, this is what we use to measure persistent symptoms. A lot of the questions are really like really non-specific. Like it's like within the last like 24 hours, have you experienced like headaches or dizziness, trouble sleeping or depression, like feeling blue? So like these are all things that people can and will experience even regardless of a brain injury. So I think it really depends on like if you get a person in on like a bad day or something like that. Yeah, it is tough because like it's all things that people do experience. And it's even when in specifically like IPV controls, even if you haven't experienced a brain injury, like the emotional sort of trauma of it will inflate those scores, which might make it look like they do meet diagnostic criteria, but yeah, it's hard to disentangle for sure.
Oh, that's great, and once again speaks to the complexity of this topic. Thank you so much. We only have time for that one question. So without further ado, we'll have Olivia Hannon.
Hello, I'll just share my slides. Okay. Is that all right? Can everyone see that? Yep. All right. Okay. So, hi. Thank you, Rory. I'm Olivia Hannon, and today I'll be presenting findings from our recent study on the cognitive effects of intimate partner violence caused brain injury. This study was just published in the Journal of Neurotrauma a few days ago. So it's hot off the press. So if you'd like to read our full article, you can scan the QR code on the screen. I'll also display this code again in my final slide. So as discussed, and as most people here probably know, brain injuries, they can disrupt neural networks responsible for our thinking abilities, which are essential for daily functioning. In IPV-BI, factors like repeated injuries, multiple mechanisms of injury, limited recovery time between injuries, and chronic psychological stress, they may amplify and prolong cognitive impacts compared to other brain injury causes like sports-related concussion. So as seen in this slide, some of the key cognitive domains that are commonly affected by brain injury include learning and memory, which is the sort of being able to take in, store, and recall information. We have attention, so this is sort of being able to focus on what we want to focus on while tuning out distractions. And then we have executive function, so this is the planning, problem solving, and ability to regulate behaviour and emotion. And then processing speed, which is sort of how quickly we can take in and act on information. And in daily life, so these domains, they work together rather than isolation. So even deficits in one domain can have a ripple effect across other domains. So for this study, it's the first Australian study of its kind, and we examined the long-term cognitive effects of IPV-related brain injury. We focused on women who had not experienced IPV or brain injury in the past 6 months, and this was so we could capture more chronic rather than the acute cognitive outcomes. We expected that women with IPV-related brain injury would perform worse on cognitive tasks than both IPV only and non-exposed control groups, and that greater exposure to IPV-caused brain injury would relate to poorer cognitive performance. So for this study, we had 146 women. They were from community settings across 2 Australian states, and these included both victim survivors and non-exposed controls. We grouped participants into the controls, so the no IPV exposure, IPV without related brain injury, so and then those with probable 1 to 6 probable IPV-related brain injuries, and those with more than 6 IPV-related brain injuries. Our cognitive measures that are shown on this slide assessed attention and working memory, verbal learning and memory, executive function, and processing speed. We statistically controlled for factors that are known to influence cognition, such as age, estimated pre-injury IQ, and also non-IPV related brain injury, so from things like sports or an accident. We also screened for PTSD, depression, anxiety, and substance use. Our main analysis, we compared cognitive scores across groups, and then we also explored whether any of the psychological factors explained or reduced any of the group differences. So here's a brief snapshot of some of our sample characteristics with a couple of sort of interesting points highlighted that I'll refer back to when I discuss the future research directions. So you'll see here that in the high exposure group, 84% of women reported brain injury from both head impacts and non-fatal strangulation. And this sort of just shows just how frequently these two mechanisms co-occur. And also, even among women without a probable IPV-related brain injury, almost 43% still reported experiencing head impact or strangulation. And among these women, nearly 2/3 said that this occurred repeatedly. So this highlights just how common these types of injuries are in IPV, even when criteria for brain injury are not met. So moving on to our main findings. We found a significant effect of IPV-related brain injury on verbal learning and memory. Just to give you an idea of how we tested verbal learning and memory, we used a word list recall task. So this is basically where researcher will read out a list of 15 words, and then the participant repeats back as many as they can remember. And we do this 5 times with the same list of words, and that gives us their total learning score. And this shows us how well a participant takes in and learns information. Then, after about half an hour of doing the other cognitive testing, we go back and ask them to recall as many of those 15 words as they can again, and that's their delayed recall score, which shows how well they've held on to that information over time. So you'll see in the slide, women with more than 6 IPV-related brain injuries perform significantly worse on learning compared to all the other groups, and on delayed recall compared to the IPV only and control groups. These differences all had moderate to large effect sizes, and they remained significant after controlling for age, pre-injury IQ, mental health factors, and non-IPV related brain injuries. We did not find any effect of IPV-BI in attention, executive function, or processing speed in this sample. So learning and memory stand out as key vulnerabilities, with that cumulative exposure predicting poorer performance. So what does this mean? This means that long-term learning and memory difficulties are linked to exposure to repeated brain injury that's caused by an intimate partner. And these deficits are not better explained by psychological factors, brain injury from other causes, age, or pre-injury IQ. Practically, these difficulties may make it harder to take in, retain, and recall information, and this can impact everyday functioning, can impact help seeking, engagement in therapy, engagement in other supports, to name a few. So service providers, they should adapt support approaches for cognitive needs. For example, including sort of visual cues, written reminders, and adjusted pacing when we're working with clients that are affected by IPV-BI. Clinically, this highlights the importance of routine screening for possible brain injury and neuropsychological referral for testing and for cognitive remediation interventions when cognitive concerns are raised and women wish to pursue that path. Future studies should further examine the cognitive effects of repeated head impacts and strangulation, as evidence suggests even subclinical injury may have cumulative effects. And research should also try and isolate the unique contribution of strangulation, though this remains challenging due to the frequent co-occurrence with head impacts. Ultimately, recognising IPV-related brain injury as a distinct and serious consequence of violence is going to be vital to ensuring the safer, more equitable, and better informed care for victim survivors. Thank you.
Excellent talk, Olivia. Really well done, very well explained, and summarizing a lot of information really fantastically. If you're willing, we've got a question for you. Although you checked off a bunch of the ones on that summary slide, so nicely done there. But thinking about your work and the intersection with policy responses, if we're likely seeing the impacts of intimate partner violence cause brain injury, whether it's diagnosed clinically or below that clinical threshold, what potential implications do you think that could have for policy, and what might that look like translating that policy into kind of functional real world steps through regulation?
Great question. And in the Australian context, we don't have great funding for neuropsychological assessments, and it can be quite hard to access. We don't have a huge amount of neuropsychologists, and so ultimately, and we also have very limited availability for IPV-specific long-term, sort of more of that long-term therapeutic services. So integrating those two together would be great. But initially, even access to neuropsychological testing for women victim survivors is going to be like really, we really need that. That's going to be really important. And hopefully this research will help raise that awareness.
Excellent. No, that's a great response and some great comments. Thank you so much for sharing your work. And without any further ado, we'll move on to Abigail Astridge.
Hello, thanks, Roy. I'll just share my screen. Cool. All right, so my name is Abigail, and I'm just going to be sharing some results from one of the papers of my PhD, and we're looking at the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and intimate partner violence caused brain injuries. So we've heard quite a bit about the realities of IPV-caused brain injuries throughout the session and today and probably yesterday as well, such as that they can be caused through blunt force trauma and also from non-fatal strangulation. We've heard about the repetitive nature of this abuse, that it can include both physical and psychological. And just with this topic, I'm going to help to unpack our understanding a little bit further by talking about how childhood trauma plays its role in these injuries. So specifically, I'm going to talk about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. So these are defined as stress and trauma that occurs in the first 18 years of life. And we broadly grouped these into subtypes based on the ACEs questionnaire, which I'll go into a bit later, where adversity can take the form of either physical and or sexual abuse, emotional abuse and neglect, adverse family conditions. So these are things as like parent substance issues or parents having mental health issues or anybody in the household, and also witnessing domestic violence against a mother or a stepmother. Just to give some background on why we decided to have a look at ACEs in this context, is that ACEs are a very well-established risk factor for both adult TBI and also adult IPV victimization. Essentially, theories have proposed that children are exposed to chronic toxic stress, and this is essentially where there is prolonged activation of their stress response system without any sort of supportive parent or relationship to buffer it. And this can cause difficulties forming relationships, increases in risk-taking behaviors, dysfunctional communication patterns, and also destructive conflict resolution, which can potentially contribute to IPV victimization later in life. But there's limited evidence on the link that might be between ACEs and IPV-BI. So essentially that's what we set out to do. We wanted to understand the associations between ACEs and IPV-BI, as well as how ACEs are associated with PTSD, depression, concussion symptoms, and also resilience. So as mentioned, we use the ACEs questionnaire to measure childhood adversity, which is a 10-item scale that asks about stress and trauma in the first 18 years of an individual's life. And we also decided to look at these 4 subtypes and how they might impact brain injury and also the mental health outcomes that I went over on the previous slide. So these subtypes were created based on, excuse me, on the items of the questionnaire. So I've color-coded it here so you can see, but basically each item prompts for an experience which broadly fits into one of these 4 categories. And the brain injury measures that we used in this study were the ones that George went over at the beginning of the session. So we used IPV-MTBI, IPV head impacts, non-fatal strangulation, and then also non-fatal strangulation caused brain injury. So for this project, we used a sample of 170 women aged between 18 and 75. Of those, 110 were victim survivors, and then we had 60 controls. So within the sample, just over 40% had experienced childhood experiences of physical and or sexual abuse. 54% had experienced emotional abuse and or neglect. Nearly 60% had experienced some sort of adverse family condition during childhood, and then just under 20% had experienced childhood experiences of domestic violence. In terms of our brain injury outcomes, nearly 30% had experienced an IPV-MTBI, 42 had experienced a hit to the head from an IPV episode, 18% had a brain injury due to strangulation, and then nearly 30% had experienced strangulation in general. And then 38 had probable PTSD, probable depression, and then 35 had probable PTSD. So for the association between ACEs and brain injury and also our NFS outcomes, we found that increased exposure to ACEs was associated with an increased risk of each of these outcomes. So this ACE score is essentially a cumulative ACE measure. So it's how many ACEs did these individuals experience? And higher exposure to ACEs meant an increased risk for each of these outcomes. In terms of the ACE subtypes, childhood physical and or sexual abuse was only associated with adult NFS exposure. Emotional abuse and or neglect, adverse childhood conditions, and also childhood experience of domestic violence were all associated with IPV-MTBI, head impacts, and also strangulation. So I don't have time to unpack all of this, but I'll just highlight some main findings here. So the non-significance of physical and or sexual abuse was surprising, but the significance of all the other ACE subtypes actually aligns with recent work that is coming out showing the significant impact of non-physical forms of harm on both children and adults, basically stating that this form of harm is more significant and quite more of a burden over and above the impacts of physical harm. So our findings nicely align with that. For the mental health outcomes, again, this cumulative exposure, so increased exposure to ACEs was associated with each of the outcomes. All 4 subtypes were associated with an increased risk of PTSD. Only emotional abuse and or neglect was associated with depression, and all except for adverse family conditions were associated with an increased concussion symptom burden. So once again, I'll just highlight the important findings from these results. So these ones also align with the recent literature on the impact of non-physical forms of harm. In terms of this concussion symptoms, we did look at these across the entire sample, regardless of brain injury exposure. As previous work, and also Charlotte highlighted this, has shown that neurobehavioral symptom burden is also associated with childhood trauma. Our findings align with this research and have also extended them to the context of IPV-caused brain injury. Additionally, it's also showing the non-specific nature of these brain injury symptoms, highlighting a need for more objective measures of identification. So we also had a look at resilience in our analysis, and what we found is that increased resilience can significantly decrease the odds of all of our mental health outcomes, so PTSD, depression, and also concussion symptoms. This highlights a pretty important avenue for potential treatments going forward. So overall, we highlighted that there is definitely a need for ACE screening at both IPV and TBI clinics. These results are quite preliminary, and further work would need to determine the biological underpinnings that might be contributing to these associations. In terms of future direction, future work would benefit from identifying objective measures of identification for brain injury, such as fluid-based biomarkers, to help overcome the non-specific nature and subjective nature of brain injury symptoms. Additionally, capturing a more nuanced view of childhood adversity could help unpack these findings further. So, for example, the MACE scale includes further questioning around peer bullying and interpersonal violence, which may help to further inform treatment. And that's all from me. Thank you. I can take one question while we switch to Justin.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Abigail. Great presentation there. One quick one in the chat from Dr. Eve Valera. Can you state what your resilience measure was?
Yeah, so it was the response to stressful experiences short form. So it was just the 4-item measure of resilience. So I think further research could also use better resilience measures.
Excellent. And then thinking about your findings and these kind of that were in line with the novel findings of not physical violence or as a childhood exposure, but those other forms. What on a kind of a functional level do you think could be done to prevent those adverse childhood experiences to kind of help mitigate those risk factors?
Yeah, I think starting conversations in schools would definitely be helpful if I don't want to add burden to teachers or anything like that, but if we can like open up conversations when children are younger and actually tell them that it's not okay and that they can seek help, will try and help us get in front of it a bit better. And then also policy prevention level would be helpful as well if the government can help intervene at some level to stop this sort of violence, and then we can hopefully stop it down the track as well.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you so much for your talk. If any questions pop into mind, Abigail will get to them in the Q&A function. And our last speaker on the trainee data blitz is Justin Brand. Justin, take it away.
Thanks, Rory. I'll just pull up the slides here. So my talk will be about this preclinical model of IPV-related brain injury that we've kind of developed in order to assist with mechanistic insights to the injury. So with IPV being a complex injury with multifacets.
Justin, sorry, I'm just going to pause you quickly. We can see the presenter view side, so you might have to flip it around.
Flip it around. That's all right. Let's just go there. Yeah, so with it being a multifaceted injury, very complex to model, and as we've heard before, often involves mild traumatic brain injury and non-fatal strangulation. The insights for these two injuries is interesting as they have many overlapping injury cascades. So we wanted to develop this model in order to illustrate the physical injuries. It also be paired with other injuries like stress to investigate the pathophysiology, blood biomarkers, behavioral deficits, and other mechanisms. So in order to model mild-traumatic brain injury, we use the lateral impact, which involves horizontal acceleration and rotational forces to the left side of the rat's head. And this MTBI leads to injury cascades such as excitotoxicity, neuroinflammation, oxidative stress. And just on your right-hand side here, you have a metric of time to self-right after injury, which is commonly commonly relates to a loss of consciousness in a clinical population. So we can see that this mild traumatic brain injury via lateral impact is kind of increasing loss of consciousness and indicative of an injury. In order to model non-fatal strangulation, we use a weight that is suspended across the trachea, and here this compresses the trachea, compresses the vasculature, reducing blood flow and reducing gas and nutrient exchange. This also leads to similar things to MTBI like ionic imbalance, excitotoxicity, oxidative stress, and inflammation. And down there in the right-hand corner is just a proof of concept of non-fatal strangulation that we did. It was a terminal procedure where we found that throughout the non-fatal strangulation procedure, we were in fact reducing cerebral blood perfusion, limiting that blood flow to the brain. So this was the first paper done by Dr. Majun's son, published in 2025, where we used both injury models of the mild traumatic brain injury and non-fatal strangulation. We do a brief neuromotor test 10 minutes after injury to check injury severity, as well as then a behavioral paradigm that involves motor tasks, as well as anxiety-like tasks and cognitive tasks to investigate behavioral changes. And then kind of the time points of after injury were 2 hours and 7 days, where we would collect blood and brain to investigate blood biomarkers and other injury mechanisms. So acute injury outcomes, we first looked at throughout the non-fatal strangulation procedure, looking at panel A when blood oxygen saturation, where we do find that the non-fatal strangulation reduces the blood oxygen throughout the procedure. And we see here in panel B that the combination of MTBI and non-fatal strangulation led to increased time to self-right, as well as in panel C, a decrease in neuromotor scores, indicating that the non-fatal strangulation produces worse acute injury outcomes. When looking at a motor task in panels A and B, here we use the beam walk task for the rats, and we can see that the combination of mild traumatic brain injury and non-fatal strangulation increases the number of slips and falls, as well as the increased time to cross the beam in this task, indicating motor deficits. And in panel C and D, we are using the Morris water maze task here, where we find that the combination of mild traumatic brain injury and non-fatal strangulation increases the time for the rats to complete this task, indicating a cognitive deficit. On the metrics of blood biomarkers, at 2 hours post-injury and 1 week post-injury in panels A and B, we're looking at GFAP, a marker of astrocytic injury, and we can see that at 2 hours, the combination of the two injuries increases the amount of GFAP found in the blood. As well as in panels C and D, here we're looking at neurofilament light, a marker of neuronal injury, where we find that the MTBI alone group, as well as the MTBI plus NFS, increased NFL, indicating that this that the mild traumatic brain injury may be driving these increases seen in NFL. And over on the right, for some gene expression analysis, we find that the combination of mild traumatic brain injury and non-fatal strangulation increases a lot of these markers of inflammation in the temporal cortex. Some other work that's going on with this model, again with Dr. Majun's son, where we're using a repetitive model with a more chronic recovery time point, and then investigating some white matter changes in the brain, as well as another study by Dr. Josh Allen, using the repetitive model and investigating psilocybin as a potential therapeutic. So really here, just highlighting the multiple uses of the model that we've kind of developed. And into kind of what my PhD work will really focus on, I want to investigate how a pre-injury stressor compared with the IPV model, will that further exacerbate symptoms? And as you saw in slide 1, there was a lot of overlapping injury cascades with MTBI and non-fatal strangulation. And just so happens that stress shares a lot of these overlapping injury cascades as well. So here we'll use pretty much the same experimental timeline, except we're adding in that acute stress immediately before the injury. And we've started by using a predator odor model, which is an acute psychological stressor. It's just a synthetic odor derived from fox, known to increase the stress response. And then we want to see how outcomes change when this pre-injury stressor is applied before the injury. Some preliminary findings on inflammatory biomarkers show that IPV is really driving changes in these inflammatory biomarkers 2 hours after injury, where you see significant changes in markers like interferon gamma, interleukin 6, interleukin 10, and interleukin 4. As well, we looked at motor deficits using that beam walk task again, and we see that at 1 hour and 24 hours, intimate partner violence brain injury is driving these increases in slips and falls, indicating with a motor deficit. And interestingly, at 24 hours after injury, it seems to be that stress is playing a factor in this motor deficit as well. Not necessarily exacerbated by the stress, but stress is having an effect. And really here, just want to highlight the impact that this model can have. Obviously, it's a very complex, IPV is a very complex injury with multifacets, not only including the physical trauma, but as we've heard with stress, emotion, and different relationship dynamics. But with the model and various iterations, we can attempt to find the best model for IPV in a preclinical setting. And just all this rodent work is happening in parallel with the clinical work you just heard. So really just trying to advance diagnosis, prognosis, survivor care, and just awareness of the injury. And with that, just want to acknowledge all the team members, the lived experience partners and participants. With none of this work is possible without them. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Great talk, Justin. Thank you for that. A ton of data and a ton of ongoing work, all gone over very nicely there. Just thinking about the model and moving from the head trauma to the head trauma, the non-fatal strangulation, and now the stress to the head trauma and non-fatal strangulation. And you'd mentioned as you were kind of going over that Venn diagram slide, the complexities. What do you think is the next step in getting a model closer to intimate partner violence? You've got the pre-stress, you've got the brain injury, the non-fatal strangulation. What else are you looking to adapt the model to?
Yeah, so I think a big thing with the pre-injury stressor is a more chronic stress paradigm, or even relating back to Abby's talk about early life stress and kind of trying to model those ACEs. But those are two ideas that I've had, as well as kind of then trying to bring in the repetitive injuries, because like we saw in Olivia's talk, there's a lot of incidents of the brain injury, the non-fatal strangulation, and it occurring in a repetitive nature.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And as the research is indicating, the violence is repetitive, as you're suggesting, and then escalating as well. It'd be interesting to look at potentially adapting a model to more severe episodes of violence and seeing what that looks like. So great stuff. And thank you. I just want to thank all the trainees in this data blitz. It was fantastic. One of the worst parts of an online conference is not being able to hear the big round of applause from the crowd, but that was a phenomenal job by everybody. Thank you so much for all that information and some really great work coming from a great group of trainees. We do have time for a couple of questions here. If anybody wants to ask to anyone in the group there, in either the chat or the Q&A feature, whatever's more comfortable. but just so much great work coming out of this Australian-Canadian group, and really excited to see what keeps coming as things evolve. Yeah, fantastic. Give people a couple of moments here if anyone wants to throw any questions in. But if not, again, just thank you to Dr. Georgia Symons, Charlotte Copas, Olivia Hannon, Abigail Astridge, and Justin Brand. Great work, fantastic stuff, and a really, really fantastic session. We'll take a quick break now, and we'll resume at 4:20 Eastern Time. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.